We've talked about ways to improve policy. We're going to dig deeper with our legislative panel, Finding Rhythm for Fathers, composed of national and Tennessee-based advocates, lawmakers, and leaders. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Representative Mark White. He's served in the Tennessee General Assembly for over 10 years, and he also serves as chairman of the House Education Administration Committee. Chairman White, come over here. Next, we have John DeBerry. He is currently serving as senior advisor to Governor Bill Lee. We'll be hearing from him personally on Wednesday. Mr. DeBerry is a former representative of Tennessee, serving House District 90 from 1995 to 2020. Mr. DeBerry. Chris Sproul served as Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives from 2020 to 2022. In Florida, he was a champion for fatherhood, spearheading the creation of Florida's Responsible Fatherhood Initiative. Chris Sproul. And last but not least, we are joined by Dr. Rufus Sylvester Lynch. He is the chair of the Strong Families Commission of Pennsylvania. After serving in senior positions in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of Pennsylvania. Dr. Lynch, welcome to you all. You'll take your positions up here on the panel. And we'll let Chairman White chair this session here.
Thank you so very much. It's a great honor to be here. Commissioner Carter, DHS, kudos to y'all for pulling this together along with Governor Lee. I cannot think of a single event more important than what we're here today for, the amplifying fatherhood. And I'm so grateful. Ever since January, when we first talked, I've been anxious for this particular day. One reason, my interest in fatherhood, besides being education director, and I started working with young people in the country of Panama 23 years ago. And then about 15 years ago, I wrote a book, and I encourage you maybe to take one on your way out. There's a table out there with free copies. It's called May I Call You Dad? Why Fathers Are Needed in the Home. And it talks about such things as why they're important in the home. Meaningful education, unconditional love, protector against predators and abusers, encourager of self-worth, be a role model, a listener, provide accountability and correction, provide a safe and stable home, to provide wisdom, understanding, and then to be a provider, a stability after leaving the home. I have a daughter that's grown with two of her own sons, and being a father, of course, never ends, right? And then lastly, provide hope for our future. And it's so very, very important. So what we would like to do today is try to put down some concrete things of moving forward. I'm always reminded of the story. Remember, I think it kind of came from 1970, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, where they all gathered on the beach, all the seagulls, and they talked about soaring on the currents and the waves, airwaves, how exciting that was. And then when they were through, they all turned around and walked back to their nest. And we want to continue to fly moving forward. So we've got a couple of things. We have 30 minutes of about 5 questions that we want to y'all to share with us, and then we will have some question and answer time. So just to kind of break the ice and everything, this will be the same question for each of you. And the first question, and we'll start with Mr. John DeBerry. From your perspective, why is it important to advocate for fathers, and what does this mean for society today?
Well, I think that all of us understand at this particular juncture in our history as a nation, as we look at our society as a whole, as we look at the condition of the family, as we look at the disproportionate minority confinement, as we look at the fact that there are troubles within relationships in this nation, I think that we all have to understand that it's something my grandfather said many, many years ago when I was young, and I really didn't understand it until I got a lot older. He said, you don't plant rotten seed and then pray for crop failure. Our crop is coming in of a lot of the things that we've done over the last 50 years that have compromised the family, that have compromised the fathers, that have compromised the upbringing of children. And I think it takes us back to where we have to take an introspective examination of ourselves and of our policies, of our churches, of our homes, because fathers are absolutely essential for a good outcome in this nation. We're not inventing fatherhood. It's been around since the beginning of time. And it's not like we've got to decide all of a sudden that fathers are important. What we've really got to do is ask ourselves, at what juncture in our history as a nation and as the world did somebody decide that they were not important? And what are the policies and the various things that made roadblocks and stumbling blocks that compromise the position of the father? Let's start there and then we move forward.
Speaker?
Yeah. Thank you. That was great, Mr. Berry. I think I'd flip it a little bit. Rather than saying advocating for fathers, we're advocating for kids who need their dads, right? You know, we advocate for fathers. We create environments by which dads feel motivated, like they feel like they have the tools. They feel like they're desired to be part of their children's lives. Why do we do that? Why is it important? You know, Dr. Farrell, Dr. Wilcox, who talked about this, they've given all the data as to why it's important, right? I came at this, I was a gang and homicide prosecutor before I ran for the legislature. Vast majority, 9.9 out of 10 folks that I put in prison for a really long time were men who didn't have a present father in their home. Got me a little curious. And then we start looking through the data and you look at all the social ills that we have as a society: drug abuse, incarceration, suicide. You know, Tennessee's recently had a terrible experience with school violence. We had that in Florida in the Parkland shooting. You look at all of these things and you say, what's the single largest common factor that unites these things? And it's no present father in the home. And once you distill it down to that, as lawmakers, as folks like Chairman White or Commissioner Carter or Governor Lee of the Tennessee General Assembly, you have events like this, which I commend the state of Tennessee. I'm a Floridian. I'm going to commend the state of Tennessee for doing, because there are not a lot of states, I feel like, who have the courage to talk about what we're talking about today. But the reality is that if we care about our children, if we care about the vibrancy of our communities, we have no choice but to have the conversation that we're having here today.
Dr. Lynch?
I'm a bit literal. I'm a social worker. I believe there are 4 reasons for advocating for fathers other than they do not do a great job advocating for themselves, and I include myself as one of them. America's future, and it is and its well-being depends upon natural resources. Fathers are one such resource, which we're not taking full advantage of. The government alone cannot solve adequately the problems that our children and families are facing daily. In fact, President Obama said once in his administration that the government can do a lot for children and families, but what it cannot do is be the father of those families. Fathers, by becoming more involved in the support of children and family, naturally contribute to the well-being of society, as do women. However, in many cases, there are barriers that impede father involvement within our society that need to be publicly acknowledged. For example, gatekeeping by mothers. and the legal system. Child welfare systemic policies that are biased against fathers, and unfortunately, personal circumstances that fathers experience on a daily basis that go unaddressed or treated. Because fathers are not coming together to address or advocate for the services they need and are entitled to. As American citizens, nothing is likely to change anytime soon. Regarding the second part of the question, from my perspective, our government must consciously take on the task of promoting greater father-family involvement in the lives of children, the caretakers of children, and the communities in which our children live, to ensure a better future for the country, its citizens, and the world community. In other words, the disconnected fatherhood programming at the local, state, and national level, which currently exists in America, is not likely to change very much without government policy that supports promoting greater father-family involvement in a non-punitive way. So here I'm promoting non-punitive policies to help promote greater father involvement.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for those introductory things. Now let's kind of get more into what does policy possibly look like. We have 3 states represented. Mr. DeBerry, I'm going to start with you. And the reason why, we served many years together on the Education Committee, and I really do miss you. And now that you're in the governor's office, there wasn't a committee went by when we're talking about initiatives on education, like how do we help, discipline or early childhood reading literacy. Every committee always usually ended up going, well, if we had stronger homes with fathers, then we wouldn't have to be talking about all this. And so I just appreciate so much your perspective. But from your position now with Governor Lee, can you share about any efforts being made in Tennessee and where you see Tennessee going in the future?
I think with Governor Lee appointing Commissioner Carter and other appointments that he's made it very clear that the state of Tennessee is looking at the family from a holistic perspective. It's one thing to stand for life and to stand for protecting the mothers and all the issues we fight for. But once that child is born, that child has to be cared for. And that's something that Governor Lee has personally said many times in our meeting. That means that we have to look at the issues that exist as they exist. We have to take the bitter pill that a lot of the issues that we have been created. When I was growing up, I'm not saying the world was perfect when I was a child, but everybody I knew at least had a daddy or a man that was involved in his or her life. The fathers were perceived as important in the home. At some point in time, that changed. And I think that very well said that the government got in the way. Ethnocentrism has gotten in the way, and we have to get back to the basics. And one of the things that Governor Lee wants to do is to say that fathers are important, and that's just not something we discovered yesterday. Fathers have always been important. And we've got to ask ourselves why and how in the world that we create this atmosphere and this culture in this society where the idea is that they are not important, that the woman can raise the children by themselves. We get into the issues of toxic masculinity and so many other issues that seem to poison the water. But as far as the state of Tennessee is concerned, we are committed to making sure that everything is done to help the fathers be involved in their children's lives. That's the direction that Governor Lee wants to go.
Thank you very much. I can't say enough how fortunate Tennessee is to have you in the position that you are in. Speaker Sprouse, Earlier, Dr. Farrell mentioned you in his presentation about the policies that you were instrumental in supporting in the state of Florida. So what has worked or programs that have been implemented in the state of Florida that you can share with us?
Yeah, thank you for that. And Dr. Farrell and I got to work very closely together on some of those policies. I actually read his book before I became speaker and took notes of some policy issues. And between him and Dr. Wilcox, I think you got a good taste of the greatest hits, right? So for us to kind of piggyback off from my friend here's statement, I think the first thing was before we got into the nitty gritty of the policy, we need to talk about how to create a movement. How do you create a movement on an issue? And I love, Dr. Wilcox, that you talked about marketing because not everybody does. And I was in a barbershop in St. Pete on a young man who runs a barbershop named Antonio Brown. And he works with young men in the community who don't have a dad, shows them what it's like to be a business owner. And I asked him, I said, hey, we're doing this. I want to do this responsible fatherhood initiative in Florida. Like, what's your opinion? What do you think? And he said, well, you got to start with propaganda. I laughed too. And then I realized he was serious. And then I realized he was absolutely right. We market everything else. We market everything in America, but we don't market the importance of what it means to be a good father. And the reality is that sometimes guys just want to be cool, right? Make it cool. We got to make fatherhood cool. We got to make it responsibility. We got to have a warrior ethos. We got to create that environment. I say that to you because when we created the Responsible Fatherhood Initiative in Florida, it was one part marketing campaign. We are going to create a marketing campaign by which we reach out to all dads, middle-class dads, dads coming out of prison, communities where there might be a male mentor for a child. They don't have a father in the home. Ones where dad's there, but he's not really there. He lives in the home, but he's not hanging out with his kids. We need to get to all fathers and help them get the tools necessary. How do we do that? That became kind of part B of the program, which was we put $70 million together in a package in the state of Florida. Part of it was marketing. A lot of it had to do with grants to organizations inside the community who were targeting that population and doing great work, where they could come to us with a plan and say, look, I serve 200 dads a year. I could serve 500 dads a year, but here's how we would need to scale. We offered them training and assistance to become more sophisticated. A lot of them were small organizations operating out of the back of a church. We then funded them to help them scale. And it's been wildly successful thus far in order to take this grassroots bottom-up movement in order to help those dads have the tools that they need to be successful. One of the organizations, I'll give you an example, All Pro Dad, some of you may have heard of it. Coach Tony Dungy is a national spokesman, but there's a breakfast once a month at the school. Most of the schools are Title I schools. And at the breakfast, there's a word of the week. It might be self-control or courage or loyalty. Dad and child talk about it. And then there's this pride moment where dad stands up in front of a room full of other men who with their kids, puts his hand on the shoulder of his son or his daughter and says, let me tell you why I'm proud of, Jimmy or Jane. And it is like, you just see grown men crying, clearly not used to seeing that kind of interaction, but it changes the child's life. So we started with this big vision, and then we went into some of the grassroots policy of custody. What does 50-50 custody look like? What does it look like if you're a social worker in a community that's dealing with children who are being removed from the home temporarily? We put a dedicated liaison inside those organizations and funded them, specifically dedicated to reuniting dad with their children, someone to focus on dad because often dad gets forgotten. So it really was a bottom-up policy. We went through really every facet of the child welfare system to try to figure out how can we lift up fathers. And a lot of times that also included things like closing the achievement gap for boys. We did create a commission specifically to look at that issue, to encourage how do we get more male teachers to teach second and third grade, not just because they understand, boys a little bit different because they were one, right? They are, at some point, but also because it may give children who don't have a male role model at home someone to look up to and someone to model. So this really is a multifaceted approach. And again, I couldn't be more happy of the state of Tennessee, who's really looking at this in a wildly collaborative way.
Thank you. Dr. Lynch, tell us about Pennsylvania.
Okay. I'll tell you about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, like many states, have been engaged in service delivery to fathers here and there over time. However, organizing our statewide citizen initiative began in 2016 and has continued to this day. We have launched the 3-point plan, and I've reduced this tremendously because of time. One, a statutory act that creates a Pennsylvania Advisory Committee on promoting greater father-family involvement in the life of their children and their families. Two, we've established a Commonwealth Citizens Council whose primary role is to monitor the implementation of Pennsylvania Act 114 of 2022 and to work with local, state, and national leaders to remove systemic obstacles in public policy that impedes greater father-family involvement. It was through this act that for the first time in Pennsylvania's history, there was a policy statement that men were important in the lives of children and families. And in fact, there are impediments that work against fathers being in the life of their children. Three, we're currently working to establish regional full father centers to address the needs of fathers, raising children, men helping to raise children, and incarcerated fathers with children. Should Commissioner Carter want me to do a virtual workshop on the process that we use to motivate our General Assembly? By the way, when our bill passed, we had 100% unanimously bill passed after 6 years of labor. And now we are organizing the citizens of the Commonwealth across the state. I will be willing to provide this pro bono, Commissioner, a workshop to talk about the steps that we've gone through. I saw that my wife had me try to pin all of this stuff down. She says I talk too much. I tend to agree with her. But I got 7 points to this thing that I can talk about when we have more time.
Thank you so very much. Let me give you a thought question now, and also our audience will be thinking as you generate questions to ask of our panelists. But what are some societal stereotypes and perceptions about fatherhood roles, and how should we challenge or support those stereotypes? Is that something that you can jump in there? And this is the same question for all. John, would you like to start out?
Go ahead. John.
Or speaker?
Please.
Go ahead.
Okay. Look, I think some of the stereotypes are, dads aren't important.
Sorry.
Dads aren't involved. Dads aren't doing what they need to do. I had sort of a funny conversation with my pastor. He was going to give the Father's Day sermon. And one year as soon as I came out of the legislature, we passed this Responsible Fatherhood Initiative. We did it together. And he said, I always feel like for the first 3 or 4 minutes of the Father's Day sermon, that I have to start by apologizing to everyone that we're about to spend the time talking about dads. I don't feel that way on Mother's Day. I heard another statistic that it's like Mother's Day is like the third or fourth most popular holiday. Like Father's Day is like 11th. I can't even name 8 other holidays. Like I don't know what those holidays are, right? But there's something in our culture, and the reality is that when you talk about fatherhood, one thing that struck me as I traveled around Florida and we talked about this issue is that it touches everybody.
Right. Exactly.
In a deeply emotional way. Deeply emotional way. Like sometimes it's awesome, right? Man, let me tell you a story about my dad. I love my dad. He just changed my life. He's the best. And sometimes it's just horrific, right? But it's deeply emotional. Sometimes it's deeply spiritual. So we have to begin to change a lot of that and change the default from dad's not present, when the reality is, look, if there's a parent that's missing, overwhelmingly statistically it's dad. So I'm not even saying it's not unfair. I mean, statistically, it is true. If a parent is missing, it's dad. But we can change that by beginning to talk about empowering fathers and talking about how this is the greatest mission you'll ever have in your whole life, is this one thing, being able to impact the lives of your children, or if you don't have children, or it's the impact the life of another young man or young woman who doesn't have a dad. You have the ability and you have the great power in order to do that. So I think that sense of mission and calling is something that we can begin to really put into our culture.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that in retrospect, we can look at the fact that And in America, we said that the fathers were not important. That idea was written into the code, written into statute, in things like the tender years doctrine, that if a child needs the mother more than the child needs the father, that the mother is instrumental in the development of the child and the father is not. That the mother, if you got to make a choice between the mother and the father, it doesn't matter who the mother is, what the mother is, how the mother has lived, whether or not she is morally competent, whether or not she is even faithful to the children, that just because she was a woman, that she was automatically more proficient and would be more involved and was a better parent. And I dealt with this within the legislature back in the 90s when we began a fatherhood initiative similar to what you did way back then. I believe President Clinton was in the White House at the time. And I remember fathers coming to the legislature and the stories that I heard were horror stories of men who worked, who had homes, who had jobs, who had done everything they possibly could to show that they were good, competent, God-fearing, hard-working, faithful to their children, and their children were still given to a mother who in no way even measured up to them. I'm not saying anything negative about mothers. We all, as you say, Mother's Day is a much better day at my church than Father's Day. But at the same time, I had to say to those guys that you're feeding the stereotype, because a lot of them were angry. They had lost their children. They had lost their rights. Many of them were paying child support for kids who were 50 years old. You know, and I had to bring them in my office and say, you're feeding the stereotypes. All of the negative stereotypes that folks have about you, you're feeding them. And I told them at that particular time, Mark, I said, look at yourselves. And one of the guys had a cigarette pack rolled up in his t-shirt, and they looked a mess. And I know it was stereotypical, and I know that they were good, hardworking men, regardless of what they looked like. But I said, you're feeding the stereotype. I said, the women in this office are frightened of you when you come in. And I said, step back, take a long look at yourself, take an introspective examination of yourself, the way you carry yourself, the way you speak, the way you approach the public, the way you approach the social workers, the way you talk to the people in children's services. I said, what type of impression are they having of you guys when they walk away? I said, if they walk away thinking you're some kind of monster, it doesn't matter what the mother is, they're not going to give you the child. And I think that fathers have got to look at a lot of the things that we have done over the last 5 decades that have eroded the public confidence in us. When we look at, as I said earlier, disproportionate minority confinement, when we look at crime in some of the communities, I know that a lot of the perceptions are stereotypical, and that behooves those of us in this room as leaders, as ministers, as teachers, as advisors, as mentors, as men and women who have prefixes and suffixes on your name that say that you understand the situation. It's incumbent upon us to help them overcome the stereotypes, look within themselves, find the best of themselves, present the best of themselves. And first of all, it's unfair for them to have to do it, Mark. I mean, the fact that you've got to prove something that to have to be able to deal with your own children and be involved in your own children's lives also we have to look at some of the ethnocentristic views that we have created ourselves as a society and make sure that we're not throwing up false roadblocks, stumbling blocks, and holes in the ground for men to fall in, even when they're doing the best that they can.
Thank you. Dr. Lynch, your perspective.
I think my colleagues have already addressed it. I would just repeating what has already been written. But I
Okay.
could go on, but I won't.
Well, there'll be a question and answer time where you can kind of jump in some things. Before we get into our audience, man, I have one last question for you that maybe get the thought process. Starting today, what are some things that our audience in the room can do to advocate for fathers, say at the local level, at the state level?
I'll take that one. First of all, be mindful of what it is that you're advocating for. Mindful of that. Remember, the value of fathers in our culture ebbs and flows, and it's not likely to change anytime soon unless we embrace and support the contributions that fathers can make to their children, their families, and our communities. If you are not a believer yourself in what fathers contribute to the well-being of children and families, you will not likely be successful in convincing government officials that the issue of fatherhood should be a priority on their agenda.
Thank you. Thank you. Speaker?
I love that. I think that, you know, obviously you all come from different roles. Some are inside the legislature, some are in the, you know, child welfare. So I'll just say this, I think talking about it is underrated. You know, I think it carries a lot of weight. I'll tell you this, as when we started talking about it in Florida, what really struck me is, as I mentioned those events to you and people coming up afterwards and sharing stories, it was always amazing to me how often the folks who were coming up to engage and say, thank you for doing this, I really like what you all are doing here, were women. They weren't men, they were women. They were moms who had experience, who saw what happens when maybe there wasn't a father that was present for their children. So I think that there's this thing like, hey, this is something you don't talk about, you know, put it next to, you know, religion and politics at the dinner table, right? List of things you don't talk about. This is like a list of things that we do talk about, is how can we do our part? If we all took a challenge, so if you're a social worker, maybe it is having someone dedicated to just reaching out to dads and figuring out, hey, what makes these folks tick to get them engaged with their child's lives. If it's in the classroom, like how do we create an environment for dads to be involved, who are going to come to school more? Or, you know, if those kids don't have a male role model, how do we create that opportunity for them to see, you know, a man worth looking up to? How do we create that opportunity? So we all have our different roles to play, and it can be also as simple as, I always say, you know, if you're a father already, you already have your own children, take one more. Go find one more who needs you, who needs someone to, you know, a male that in particular that you can role model, because as Dr. Farrell says, the boys seem to take this harder, which is why we see it play out in the achievement gap. But boys and girls who don't have a dad, adopt one more and try to give them an opportunity to learn what it means to be a man.
John, do you want to add something to that? Did you want to add something to that?
I'll add this if you permit me. And, you know, Commissioner Carter, I hope it's okay to just call a spade a spade. Two things. Number one, my daughter and I was sitting on our porch there in Memphis, and we live on a street that borders Bellevue, which is a major thoroughfare there in Memphis, Tennessee. And we were sitting on our porch. My daughter, who now has 2 master's degrees from Ole Miss and University of Memphis, she was 9 years old at the time. And we were sitting in our swing, enjoying a nice spring or fall day. I know it was a nice day. And a little girl, a young girl, walked down Bellevue, scantily clad, and we all grown. I don't have to tell you what was going on when she was walking down Bellevue. And my 9-year-old daughter looked at her and she says, look at that. And I stopped her right then. I said, you stop right now. And I made her look me in the eye, and she was tearing up. I said, the difference between that child right there and you is me. I said, that's the difference. I said, she didn't have a me, or she wouldn't be on that street right now. And when we look around our society right now, many of the ills that we have, and some of them have been created. One second thing, Mark, if you permit me, I was managing an apartment complex in the 70s. My wife and I, when she was alive at the time in the 70s, and it was a huge complex there in Memphis, and it was filled with women. And the law said that they couldn't have a man in the house. I tell you what, I had to look up to heaven at all the immaculate conceptions that were in that apartment complex. The fact is, there had been laws that were created that kept those families, those men away from those children, for them to get housing and education and transportation and childcare. All that stuff is good, but it should not have eliminated the man. And that was the beginning. If we go back and look at it and call a spade and go back and look at it, we can trace the issues we're dealing with right now to the so-called wars on poverty that created those pieces of legislation.
Thank you for those fantastic comments. And of course, our audience, I mean, y'all the frontline troops. You deal with this every day or you wouldn't be here. And it's just how very, very important this issue is. I know when I work with, of course, it's a worldwide problem. When I work with children in the country of Panama who grow up on dirt floors, and I would interview them for a scholarship so we could keep them in school, or else they're recycling that poverty. And I'd ask them, why do you want a scholarship to continue in school? And to watch the little lips tremble when they say, well, we just don't have the money. There's not a father in our home, and mother's doing everything she can, but there's just not any money for us to continue in school. And so this is what we're all here for. And so we can't give up on this. We got to keep moving forward. Why don't we now go to some maybe some questions from the audience?
Yeah, if you would put your hand up and we'll send Mike with the mic. Commissioner Carter with the first question.
Mike, thanks so much. This is for Speakers Sprouse and Dr. Lynch. In today's hyper-partisan political environment, how is it possible that you're able to develop and shepherd a piece of legislation that got complete bipartisan support?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You all watch the evening news, so you realize that getting legislative chambers to agree that this is a bottle of water is darn near impossible, right? But we stood on the steps of, Florida has a new Capitol and old Capitol. We stood on the steps of the old Capitol about an hour before we walked in with Republicans, Democrats, men, women, black, white, all there united for one purpose, and that was to pass this $75 million bill dealing with responsible fatherhood initiative in the state of Florida. And we walked in and it was unanimous. Not a single member voted against it. And the vast majority of folks who debated for it were members of both parties. It was evenly split. In fact, we asked the Democrats to debate more on it because we weren't used to it. So we wanted to, hear from the other party more because there's an outpouring of support for the legislation. But I think it goes back, Commissioner Carter, to your question, to the fact that everybody's got a heart for this. Sometimes it's a good story, sometimes it's a bad story, but everybody has a story. And I think that they realize that whether that was a positive impact on their life or it was something that they had to work to overcome in their life, that they wanted to arm our children, which I go back to, yeah, we want to interact with dads, but who we're saving is our kids. And it's like the one time in my legislative career where instead of saying, hey, we're going to fund money for drug treatment, which is wildly important, or we're going to fund money for remediation classes for kids, which is wildly important, or for reentry for people coming out of prison, which is really important. All those things are really important, but they're after the fact. They're downstream. We gave our members of both parties an opportunity to get upstream to say, what if it never happened? What if that kid never went to prison? And my colleagues and the Republican side were very fond of talking about, return on investment. What's the return on investment for a kid who is going to go to prison who doesn't? Or a kid who's going to have a drug addiction who doesn't? Or a kid who's going to be displaced in housing and live in poverty, but doesn't? That's the best ROI in America.
That's right.
Commissioner, in response to your question, I said earlier that it took us 6 years to get the bill. That's not really true. It took us 3, but we spent the first 3 years organizing Pennsylvanians,
Working together.
getting them excited about this, how important this issue was. And then, I hope I don't offend anybody, but I'm a child of the 60s, so we tell it like it is. One day after giving a speech, just one example, a woman from the main line, I guess they have them all over America, but it's the main line in Philadelphia, white woman, wealthy, walked up to me and said, "Dr. Lynch, please keep up the good work." And I've consistently asked audiences, why do you think this white woman from the main line walked up to me to say, "Keep up my good work"? Well, people would give, just like in school, to give you answers, but it's all the wrong answer. I said, no. She understood exactly what we were talking about. That's why. So I said, well, why is she whispering? She was whispering because she did not want to appear to be not on the side of women. When we began in 2019, this is all the same process, just different years. It's when we began our work in the legislature. And we thought about, Speaker, having we're just trying to get it moving, thinking about, well, how do you get resolution? Yeah. And after a while, you know what we said? It's easier to get a bill than to get a resolution. We went walking around the offices. I went in the Speaker's office. And I will never forget this until the day I die. The Speaker said, well, who are you? You in the office? And I said, I'm Rufus Lynch, blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, how can I help you? And he thought that I was like people come in trying to push things. And I said, no. He said, well, you want to give you a ride around the office? See that office there? I said, yes, sir. He said, why are you smiling? I said, that used to be my office when I was the executive assistant to the chief of staff of the Speaker of the House. Theodore Irvis, the first African-American speaker in America and Pennsylvania. And he looked at me when we began to talk, and I can see it and feel it as sure as I'm sitting in this seat. He said one thing that has motivated me and everyone I've ever talked to. He said it was about time. That's all he said. It's about time. And no disrespect to my colleagues here, because I'm not one. I always tell people, politicians don't lead the parade. They follow the parade, and I always say until they get to the mic, and when they've gotten to the mic, they figured out what their position is going to be. I work for the Speaker of the House. I work for the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, and I work for the Lieutenant Governor. I give a shout out to my legislature. We never, ever, ever had opposition to what we were trying to do. Primarily because we did a lot of the legwork. The Speaker comes with position. I'm Rufus, I'm a social worker out of Philly too. Look at that in Pennsylvania. The bottom line is, this is an issue for everyone, and that's what we preach. And that's what I'm so pleased to hear today with our speakers, members of the panel. We're all in agreement that fatherhood, it's about all fathers. And one of the things that we adamantly fight about, and we have won in Pennsylvania in this conversation, it is not about poor, Black, and brown people. It's about all Americans, all fathers, all children. And unless we're able to address that as an issue, we're not going to change anything anytime soon. Nothing. We've got to understand, and my whole point for my message early on about children and fathers, I think we all know that that's important. Many people know that, for they live it or someone stole them. But we need to think about and release men from the chains around their neck and their feet to reconnect with their government, the future of this country, and the security of our families. That's what we need to see happening with fathers in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, in the United States. I think I'm in Pennsylvania somewhere. But the bottom line is, I mean it when I say that America uses natural resources. A natural resource that we have failed to use are the men in this country. I think one of the speakers earlier today talked about war and how men react to that and stood up and delivered themselves for that. We have to find reason to get fathers to be involved again in such a way that they can't wait to do it. And it can't be something that we play with them off and on about. We really have to get men to want to be men again and to take on the responsibility for securing the future of our family, children, our country. They all go together. They're not separated.
All right. Thank you. Saw another hand up, gentleman in red.
Good afternoon. Feliciano Lewis, CEO of Men for Men LLC out of Atlanta, Valdosta, Georgia. One of the comments that I want to make, I was at the legislative Head Start on the Hill last week. And Head Start is basically made particularly out of women. I think I've seen Avis files here. When I started my group in Valdosta, I went in talking about the importance of fathers. I had to basically call Ms. Avis to come in and talk to my staff because they said I was woman bashing. Woman bashing. I was just telling what men wanted, what men needed. So in that situation, 3 years later, Avis, they calling me, breaking down the door, when you gonna send me some pictures for my Men for Men board? So I think in that we gotta keep pushing. I could have quit that day. I was upset. I was upset being up at Capitol Hill that I got all these women and they was talking about going to talk to Senator Cobb that wants to cut money for Head Start. It does what it says. It's a head start on life. What we do in our program, I have a female ED. She says she took them out to a ball game. She knew she sounded like Charlie Brown. When I come in, I'm talking about being a man. I'm talking about if you're gonna start this business, I got a guy right now, he finally got his food truck going. 3 years later, I didn't give up. I have two young men, one dyslexic, foster child, went through some stuff in his life. His kid was special need. He was scared to go to the school. So you're saying, why didn't they come? Sometimes men are scared.
Yes.
We won't admit it, but I'm not gonna tell you you're doing a good job because my good job is gonna be going out to make that money somewhere. That's how I'll take care of my family. So in that, he may not know how to come. I heard somebody say a lot of times they don't know how to speak up for themselves. But that's when we come in as practitioners. That young man right now was from Kentucky, moved to Georgia. He had all the tools. He didn't know anybody. But I had another young man, an African-American young man, served 15 years in prison, and he knew how to build anything. On my call that night, I said, you know what? Y'all gonna have a business. They have a business now. But in that also too, you still gotta help them a little bit because we just had a conference and they went into the conference with t-shirts and jeans on, looking like they were working. You don't do that. I actually gave them a call and said, this is how we do it. Tomorrow we're going to the store and I'm gonna buy you an outfit. So if we're gonna do this, and I heard you say, Mr. DeBerry, being real, stop playing around with men and get real. If you're gonna do this work, come on, I mean, there's no men in this building, don't play with me, come directly at me. And I'm gonna leave you with this. One of the things I love about what's going on now, everybody talking about the 3-0, the 3-1 record. Dion is actually, he's been a father after going through a very hard situation to fight for his kids. And now he has 4 of them with him. Thank you.
All right, see another hand up? We're going kind of like table back.
Thank
Get your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Roy Day. My official title is father. I live in Benton County. We all know, everyone here in this room knows that the best form of leadership is through example. You lead by example. Here in the state of Tennessee and here in this room, I see a lot of fine examples of fathers. My question to the board members, other people, is it possible, one, and do you think it would be beneficial to have some sort of program or like a PSA, as someone earlier mentioned, where we focus on a local father, a local Tennessee father who's leading by example, who's doing the right thing, who's setting the example of what a father is and should be, to give those young men and women an example of what they should aspire to be, and to be even better than my father. Where's the group? I have 3 young daughters, 4, 5, and 6, and I've got a 30-year-old son. I've always tried to prepare them for this harsh world. And I think that there are a lot of fathers here in this state who should be showcased. They should be on a PSA. And that would give all these other fathers who see this on TV go, yes, that's what I've been talking about. Or yes, that is something that I can do with my children. Just a thought. Do you think that's possible? Do you think that would help? Is it at least a step in the right direction? Something. Can we do this?
Yeah. I think it is possible, and I'll do you one better. You're going to have a good example, because that's exactly what we're doing in Florida. You know, with the marketing campaign, they went out and hired a marketing firm who did marketing for Chick-fil-A. Exactly for that reason. Like, let's show dads in what should be their natural habitat, different dads, different scenes, right? To be able to show, like, hey, sometimes it's about goofing off. Sometimes it's about physical play. Sometimes it's about modeling good work ethic, or being a loving spouse, or whatever that is. And it reminded me, and part of the marketing thing, when I was a kid, I don't know if you guys remember, I think it was like a PBS thing, but like you saw this commercial and all you see is the windowsill, and there's a guy in there, you know, maybe in his mid to late 30s, and he's dancing, and he looks like just a fool, right? He looks like a fool, he's dancing. And then as they close in on the window, there's a little girl below the windowsill. He's dancing with his daughter. And Tom Selleck, I think, was the voice. And he says, it takes a man to be a dad, right? It's that kind of moment, which I think is what you're describing, that we are trying to capture in the marketing campaign in Florida. And if we do our job, like I hope we will, it is my hope that it will be something that can be taken and adopted and used throughout the country.
Mr. Day, you're right on target. That's exactly what we need to do. And right before lunch, in the group that our breakout group, we talk about this very thing. We're talking about PSAs. I think it's time for the propaganda.
Yes,
and if you want to call it that. And so we already have a Zoom schedule for October 5th at I think at 6 o'clock in the evening. We're going to put together those ideas. And so we're moving forward, but you're right on target. It's time for that.
I made a speech one time to a group of fathers and men that I was asked to talk to, and good comments already made, and I think more to come. But I gave something anecdotal. My eldest daughter's name is Shavita. We were having a birthday party back when she may have been 10 years old. I will lose my life if I told you how old she is now. I will not do that. But she was about 10 years old. And she had her friends from school at home. My wife had fixed up the dining room, put all, I think, Huff and Puff and whatever back in the day, cartoon character. And I noticed that everywhere I went, there were little girls following me. I went in the kitchen, they were following me. I went back in the dining room, they were following me. I went to the living room, they were following me. And eventually, after the party, I asked my daughter, I said, why were those little girls following me around? She said, Daddy, they were following you around and they kept saying,
Shavita got a daddy. Shavita got a daddy. What? Shavita got a daddy. And they were following me around in the house saying, Shavita got a daddy. After I made that speech and gave that little remembrance, several fathers came to me and said, basically, what it did was bring them to accountability and understanding that children are always watching and they always needed their daddies. And a lot of them just said that changed the way they viewed themselves with their children.
Okay, gentlemen, I think we just have time for wrap-up comments, so.
I like to thank the gentleman in the back who raised the question. I couldn't hear his name before, and the speaker spoke to his question. But I want to say that issue that you raised about this commonality in terms of how do we organize and bring fathers together, notwithstanding anything, is our greatest challenge. Because we still have to get men to understand that they are part and parcel to this movement. It's not just about child support enforcement. It's not about how much money they're paying their lawyers, because they're still mad and angry. We've got to find a way when we make these changes that men can find peace in what it is that we're proposing. And I like this idea of the PSA's pieces. I think it makes a lot of sense. And that's going to be our biggest challenge, because our goal is at the end of this, we have all fathers in Pennsylvania under the same umbrella, if you will, for lack of a better word, that we're all fathers and we all have something in common, notwithstanding who we are, where we are, and all the other R's. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you again to Chairman White and Commissioner Carter, Governor Lee, the General Assembly for doing this work. Here's what I'd say. I don't want to say something that's already been said. I believe we are living at a unique time in the last 50 years on this particular issue. I've been obviously in Florida, here in Tennessee, and Texas, and Iowa, and a couple other places talking about fatherhood, responsible fatherhood initiatives, policy around this topic. And there's something different going on now at this particular point in our history than I have noticed certainly in the public policy conversation for a very long time. I don't know what it is. I can't articulate to you why. All I can tell you is that Tennessee, Florida is the tip of the spear on this policy, and what we do will matter for the rest of the country. They will watch. And if we do our job correctly, and I believe that Commissioner Carter, I believe you, Governor Lee, and the General Assembly will, the rest of the country will copy you. The rest of the country will look at Tennessee, they will look at Florida and say, we know we wanted to do something. We had this feeling, we've been talking about it, but we didn't know what to do, and now we do. And when that happens, it is my belief that we can look back, Chairman White, at the event that you had here today and make that as one of the reasons that not just the state of Tennessee or the state of Florida began a national movement on fatherhood that traveled across America. So thank you all very much.
This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. This is a matter of national defense, the continuing of our nation, the rebuilding of our families. We got to get rid of a lot of terms that were coined over the years, like deadbeat dad. And what's a deadbeat dad? And when you look at a lot of those guys that I talked to during the time when we first started trying to do this a long time ago, it was not that they did not want to participate. They did not want to contribute, but there have been so many things in the way that did not excuse them. They had no right to throw all the responsibility on the women, but that still makes it important. It's incumbent upon us to make sure that whatever got in the way that created what we're dealing with right now, that it ends right now. And I think Mark and I both, we've said this from the floor for many years, that politicians look to the next election, but statesmen look to the next generation.
Amen.
And we've got to start looking to the next generation.
And I just want to thank each of you for being here. I kind of make the comparison, when I said in education committee, we can pass legislation to change things in school, like reading literacy, but nothing happens without the teachers in the classroom. And so that's where the rubber meets the road. And so, and that's each of you. So thank you. Push us. I've been the legislature. This is my 14th year. I'm about to start pushing my luck a bit. I have one more year on the second. I'm afraid to give it up because I've got this book 15 years ago. I've been basically praying for this day would come that we could do. And so you don't give up. Take the board. So Commissioner Carter, DHS.